Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Jennifer. In this video, I'll be showing you how I made this Santa Claus mosaic inspired by a picture I saw on Pinterest. If you haven't been following, this is part of my Christmas countdown series going on right now. So check out the other crafts I've made so far if you haven't already. I will walk you through the steps to create this beautiful piece and give you tips and tricks for a successful finished product. So if you're interested in making this whimsical Santa, stay with me and I'll show you how I did it. To begin, I took a look at the original photo and compared it to the Etsy listings measurements, then drew a replica. As a side note, I will include the link to the Etsy listing in case anyone wants to buy this craft rather than making it. This is one of the more challenging builds in my countdown. I knew that the end product needed to be 4 times the size of my printout, so I measured the picture and took each number and multiplied that by 4. The mosaic consists of 7 vertical rows, and each strip of wood measures 1.25 inches wide. You will need approximately 22 feet to complete this project. Because there are a lot of numbers associated with this craft, I will include a complete cut list in the description for your reference. The overall height of my inspiration piece is 32 inches and the width is 10 inches. I believe this includes the framed portion. Do not refer to the calculations in this particular clip, as my method for cutting some of the boards changed as I got further into the build. Next, I took a look at my supplies and chose this beautiful 3/4 inch cedar board. I lightly sanded the surface to remove any imperfections, then set my table saw to 1.25 inches and ripped the board strips using the help of my Microjig gripper to go. I was left with a random piece, so I cut a very thin strip that measures 1/4 inch wide to create the little detail that you see at the top of Santa's hat. Being honest, now that I finished this project, I might eliminate that piece altogether. It barely shows or makes a difference overall, but I'll include it in the cut list and instructions. You're also going to need a piece of plywood or other material for a backing. I had this nice drawer front that was the right size, but decided I didn't want to waste it on this project, so I cut a piece of 3/4 inch plywood instead. To allow for any mistakes, I overcut the piece slightly, leaving myself some wiggle room on the top, bottom, and right margin. The finished Santa mosaic portion measures 9 inches wide by 32 inches high, so my advice would be to add an extra inch in case you need it later. Once I was ready to start cutting each individual piece, I moved into my basement workshop where it's warmer. I'm going to mention the measurements that get this project started or are essential, but don't worry, I'll list everything in the description. I began by overcutting the horizontal white part of Santa's hat. I cut this to about 10.5 inches, knowing some of it will be trimmed off later. In an attempt to make this easy to follow, I'll refer to the layout in vertical rows, one starting at the left and moving right, ending with row 7. I cut the 2 bordering pieces of Santa's beard. They measure 12 inches each and are in row 1 and 7. To get them exact, I placed the first piece on top of my stalk and slid it to the right side of my blade. Next, you'll need to cut the remainder of his beard for rows 2 through 6. You'll need 5 pieces at 11 inches each. I made sure to avoid cutting through any knots and was mindful to leave myself with nice, long scraps instead of dinky, unworkable pieces. I took everything over to my work table and laid them out in roughly the spots they will end up in. Then I cut the pieces that will make up the skin tone part of Santa's face. Rows 2, 3, 5, and 6 measure 3 inches long, and the center row 4 that will become Santa's nose is 4.5 inches long. You might see from my notes that I intended to cut one big piece, then score each section that will make up the eyes and cheeks, but I changed my mind later on. Also, in rows 3 and 5, you will need 2 1/2-inch pieces for the eyes and 2 3/4 inch pieces that go directly under the eyes. For the cheeks, in rows 3 and 5, you will need 2 1.5-inch pieces. For row 4, you will need 1 3-inch piece that makes up the nose and mouth. This is the foundation of this project, and everything else will be listed in the description because it's just too much to include in the spoken instructions. I really wanted to build the Santa and realized it would be a nightmare to explain, so hopefully I haven't lost anyone yet. At this point, I sanded the rough edges and began painting the pieces. I initially thought I would paint the facial hair with a couple coats of white, but liked the rustic textured look of just one. For the cheeks, nose, and mouth, I chose a pale pink, then lightly brushed on a darker rose to give it a little dimension. The eyes are matte black, but you might want to paint them brown, blue, or green. I also like the way the smooth underside of the wood looked versus the rough side, and I chose to only have the coarse grain showing on the parts that will get painted white. Here's a look at everything laid out, and before attaching, I cut this little 1/4-inch trim piece that goes on the top of the hat. Looking at it now after the fact, I realized the larger brim part is supposed to rest higher, like the beard and other accent pieces, but I don't know that I'd necessarily like that, and I'm glad I made mine at the same depth as the face and hat, but you could adapt this to your preference. Next, I began gluing and pin nailing my main pieces to the plywood backing. You'll want to come down 11 inches from the very top to the top of the brim. I used my Capro square because it has an extra long ruler, and I made a horizontal mark, then chose pin nails that are long enough to go entirely through each piece and into the plywood without coming out the very back. I attached the little trim piece to the hat brim, then nailed it into place. Then, making sure the 12-inch beard piece in row 1 was perfectly lined up, I secured it. Each subsequent puzzle piece followed, and I was careful to keep everything tight and neat. If I had this to do over again, I would only glue the skin tone areas in place versus pin nailing them too. The rest of the pieces will get touched up with paint, making the nail holes barely visible, but I will need to be very careful with wood filler on the skin parts because it will show. Next, I began working on the red hat portion. When looking at the original photo, I noticed the peak of the hat isn't perfectly centered. This allows for the floppy section to the right and tassel on the end. I came in 4¼ inches from the left side and drew a vertical line as a guide. Cutting these pieces was a little difficult. I would suggest getting the top 2 pieces placed and tacked onto the plywood, then filling in the rest. You will have one blunt edge and one 45-degree cut on each, except for the little triangle at the brim area. The top left corner of the first piece lines up with the vertical line and forms a herringbone pattern. I lightly place these without pushing them in too tight, as I want to remove and paint them first. I also cut 2 3-inch diamond shapes. The measurement is taken from the top of the parallelogram from left to right. Then I deviated from my inspiration piece slightly to fill in the top blue and lower red areas. Rather than creating a herringbone pattern, which adds to the complexity of this project, I chose to continue with vertical rows. The bottom red portion is straight cuts. I actually left mine a tiny bit past the plywood, as I will trim this later. Then I painted the suit and hat a nice bright red. This is just regular craft paint. I believe I got it from Dollar General. I glued and pin nailed the pieces into place, and at this point everything really started to come together. I touched up the paint to conceal the pin nail holes. They're really pretty minute, but you can see the shiny metal heads when looking down into the holes, so it's best to just conceal them with paint. The blue section at the top is a bit more difficult, as there are blunt, 45-degree and specialized cuts involved. For the peak and parallelogram areas around the floppy hat, I needed to use my bandsaw to safely complete them, but you could use a fine finish handsaw as well. I used cutoff scraps to fill in the area under the floppy hat. I will detail the measurements in the description as blue section pieces 1 through 9. I painted everything a nice deep blue. The color is English Navy from Apple Barrel and can be found at Walmart. While those pieces were drying, I cut each half of the mustache, which are shaped like a trapezoid with 45-degree angles on each end that point inward. I added a little piece of painter's tape with a line to mark center, then I very carefully shaved off little slivers of each half until they perfectly joined in the center and hit at the right and left margins. I taped them together and also anchored them to the miter saw table and fence with painter's tape so I could cut tiny increments off without getting my hands close to the blade. Then I placed them on the workpiece and cut off the top portion of the angle so that it lines up with the center of the nose and joins above the mouth, exposing a small triangle. Then I cut the beard accent pieces and eyebrows and took 2 scrap triangles that matched in size and put them together to form a square tassel. The one in the picture is larger, but I kind of like them to be a bit smaller. Then I painted everything white, keeping in mind I also need to paint the sides of all of these elements as they will show because they're raised. When the blue paint was dry, I began assembling that section. When you're working with large areas, it's easier to apply the glue to the plywood rather than each individual piece. I used a large square to make sure my right side wasn't too far off course. When the glue was dry, I took the entire piece outside and very carefully cut the right margin off in increments until it was perfect. I also evened out the top and bottom on my miter saw and cut 1 3/4 inch cedar strips to make up the frame. Then I used white acrylic paint pens to carefully draw the little circles on the eyes and cheeks. I used a pencil as a spacer and took my time. Then I cut and attached the frame before adding the finishing accent pieces. I used the help of clamps and a square to get everything perfectly spaced. As you can see, my end pieces have a pattern cut into them because the scrap piece I used was originally cedar siding. I decided to have it face out and look intentional rather than facing it inward because you'd be able to see the grooves at each corner. To attach the mustache, you'll want to visually line up the top with the bottom of the cheeks and also make sure the bottoms are perfectly horizontal. I tape my square to keep it from shifting during this very critical time. I also used my square to place the eyebrows. They are a 1/2 inch up from the eyes and line up with rows 3 and 5. As for the tassel at the end of the hat, the original has it as a square, but I liked it placed on a 45 so it looks like a diamond. Then I centered the beard portion with the center of the mustache and tacked it into place. Again, I will list all of the measurements in the description as this is pretty complex to describe. You could stop here, but somehow I miscalculated the hat portion and ended up with a larger expanse of blue than the original. So I decided to add wooden craft stars that are left over from my time as a flag maker. I placed them in a random pattern and used 2 different sizes to add depth. And here is the finished product. I actually think I like it better with the addition of the stars and the deviation on the hat too. Otherwise, everything else looks exactly like my inspiration piece, and I couldn't be more pleased with the end result. So let me know what you think of this project in the comments and if you like the slight variations I made from the original. So I hope you enjoyed watching this video and that it inspires you to make it or one of the other crafts I featured so far in my countdown. I have one more project planned for tomorrow, so make sure you're following so you won't miss what I have in store. You can also find me on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook as well. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, take care.